why the standards of good eating have fallen so precipitously in Britain. And this is in the 1960s, 70s, thereabout, 70s. And one possibility is relying on imported meat. Sheep from New Zealand, pigs from Denmark, and that sort of thing. To the town dweller, such meat comes as if by magic, from nowhere. We have been long cut off from the experience of food production. We have come to regard it with as little curiosity as if it were boot polish. I remember the situation during the last war, which became a coals-in-the-bath sort of cliché, when children evacuated from the big towns refused to drink milk because it came from those dirty cows rather than from a nice, clean tin. This always raises a laugh, but many people's attitude towards food generally is precisely the same today, except that now it has to be wrapped in nice, clean plastic. And the production of food is becoming so sanitized, so sterile, that should we venture abroad, stomach troubles become inevitable. This already happens to American travelers. Are we destined to suffer in the same way from our demand for foodless food? Is this over-urbanization the reason why we have not understood the demands we should have been making from the intensive farming of the last 40 years, and now find ourselves landed with quantity rather than quality, with boredom, repugnance, and even, it now seems, with an increase in food poisoning and pollution? We have not controlled the farmers, our demands have not balanced their progress, and we have lost out. What butcher these days dares to sell brains, sweetbreads, spinal marrow for fear of scrapie? We have not understood the impiety of feeding ruminant animals with the rehashed bodies of dead sheep. Now we see an almost biblical judgment in the matter of offal, and in the matter of eggs and poultry as well, from the appalling practice of feeding battery chickens on the recycled bodies of their dead fellows. She can turn a phrase. Pigs are another matter. Pigs will eat anything. Indeed, they were the great scavengers of towns before the era of dust carts and rubbish collections. And being so convenient and easy to rear, the pig was the ideal animal for cottagers. A side of bacon hanging in the chimney to smoke was every countryman's aim, and its flavor would improve his soups and yield some kind of joint for Sunday eating. The high point of cured pork was ham, preferably dry cured, which gave it the chance to mature to a slow perfection. It became a symbol of festive occasions, such as the meal provided for mourners, as H.G. Wells describes in Mr. Polly. The funeral in the rather cold wind, appropriate, had proved wonderfully appetizing, and every eye brightened at the sight of the cold collation that was now spread in the front room. There were 2 cold boiled chickens, which Johnson carved with great care and justice. I would like to carve chickens with justice. And a nice piece of ham, some brawn, and a steak and kidney pie, a large bowl of salad, and several sorts of pickles, and afterwards some cold apple tart, jam roll, and a good piece of Stilton cheese, lots of bottled beer, some lemonade for the ladies, and milk for Master Punt. A very bright and satisfying meal." End quote. I recall the rather more robust humor of Lancashire, and of one of the Eli stories. Eli was very ill. He lay dying upstairs in his bedroom. His wife ran up and said, "Eli, my dear, Eli, my darling, is there anything you'd fancy by way of a bite of food?" "Oh, yes," he said. "I fancy a slice of that ham I can smell you cooking downstairs." "Oh, Eli, you can't have that. That ham is for the wake." I love it. Okay, we've got a few of us now. How's the sound? There's some wind, so I can see the mic spiking. I want to make sure it's not muffling too much. Yes, I'll try to kind of create a windshield here, or something. I don't actually know where the mic is on this contraption. Yeah, it's not that bad on Vashon. It's actually really sunny over there. But we happen to be in a little valley where the Wi-Fi is strong enough to accommodate all of us. And there's a bit of a wind tunnel in the valley. So this would be a good place to build the Vashon smoker, by the way, because there is a consistent flow of air from the gully down here and the little valley of alder trees and scrub up through the park, up through the big lawn, and up through the front of the library here. And so if we put a smoker here with vents on the prevailing wind side, then it will keep a nice smolder for a long time. Okay, good. More people joining. We've got a couple more minutes. I've been thinking about building smokers because I officially reached the limit of my cheap little smoking setup, my little Weber grill. I have been using it so far beyond its design parameters for many years now, and it finally just up and died. And so I'm thinking about how to build the proper smoker at my house, and I think my general approach is going to be build all the approaches into one structure, if you know what I mean. There's several ways to fire a smoker, to generate smoke, and I think I want all of them. I want the capacity to do all of them. Because that flexibility is pretty indispensable, especially if you are a very seasonal curer. And so I think I want to build a masonry building. This is my fantasy. I don't know when this will happen, but masonry would be the way to go. Oh, the crows have arrived. And I would like the floor to be concrete, or at least something very compacted, because I want to be able to have the option to build a fire on the floor, right on the floor of the smoker, with sawdust in particular. Lay down some straw, and then a nice zigzag long snake of aromatic alder wood, or maple wood, or some sawdust, and then light that, and let the smoke get blue, and then shut the doors. And then I would also like a remote firebox, like a wood stove, with a long pipe running into the smokehouse to really do a very cold smoke. And then I'd even want another fire chamber just outside, but directly adjacent to the wall of the smoker, with just holes, that run from that chamber right into the smoker. And that's the one that you would need to be positioned in the prevailing wind, so you get the constant blow of air to keep the fire ignited. That's the kind of smoker I want, and I think I want 2 chimneys with baffles, one on either end. I just want to build in as much flexibility as possible. And I would like there to be wire mesh vents, so they are rat proof, but they will let air in all the way around the bottom of the smoker, almost at ground level, so that oxygen can be pulled in from in the case that I'm smoldering sawdust on the ground, oxygen will be pulled in so we don't create a completely anaerobic environment. So someday, that's the smoker I want to create. All of that to say, it will enable the cold smoking of bacon. And to that end, we want a nice blue smoke. If you're going to be smoking for any prolonged amount of time, it's worth locking in the blue smoke. You can get a choked fire to do, vast plumes of white smoke, or really cool, extra cold smoke. But I really think the flavor and there's just enough temperature. I think that, the warmer the smoke is, without cooking the meat, but if it's a little warmer, then the smoke adheres a little better. You get it better smoking. And blue smoke, man, that's your signal that you've hit the right temp. And so, however you can ensure the subtle blue smokery. Okay. Good, it sounds like you're still hearing me. If it gets too bad, I can go sit in my van, which does not quite have the ambiance of the blowing firs behind me, but it's not windy in there. Oh yeah, the smokehouses of the South had a barrel inside that they had fire in. Yeah, that's awesome. I would imagine smokehouses in the South would be just absolutely essential to curing, I'm definitely, even up here in the Pacific Northwest, I find that, my goal is to salt the bacon just enough to preserve it, but no more than that. And so I'm always trying to ride the edge of preservation, because Flavortown is right next door to spoilage land, so you just salt it just enough and then stop salting it, because you don't just want to taste salt pork. And so when you're riding the edge like that, it can be a little riskier in the warmer months of the year. And so I actually regard the cold smoking, as a really decisive element of the cure when you're just going for minimal salt. And there's sometimes I can tell that if I hang the bacon without smoking it in the warmer months and I've just minimally salted it, it'll get a little bit more sticky or bacterial growth on the surface. It might not even go all the way to spoilage, but it'll be close, and I can actually prevent that with the beneficent effect of smoke, because smoke dries out the surface, which is why I think in the South it'd be so essential, because wood burning, consumes moisture in the air, and so it creates a dry environment. And for some of the humid climates in the South, that would just be totally essential, I would imagine. And it certainly helps here. And it's not only the dehydration that smoking can offer, because, curing itself is just the management or removal of water. And so any process whereby you can achieve that has a curative effect. But it's also a pH thing. Phenols and other elements in the smoke actually drop the pH on the surface of the meat. They make it more acidic, which also inhibits the growth of undesirable bacteria. So smoking is just a brilliant thing. It's not essential, but my goodness. We do many things that aren't essential, and thank God for that. Yeah, it's interesting, Daniel. Our humidity is so unreliable. It is, I guess it's directly related to cloud cover. So right now, there's not a cloud in the sky. It's cold and my lips are cracking. It is dry as a bone out here. And by this afternoon or tomorrow morning, we could have cloud cover and we'll be up to like 80% humidity. It changes daily here. It's really a trial, particularly in the making of salami. That's really where I notice it. Salami is, a fermentation, and so it is the most sensitive to humidity because the bacteria needs just enough moisture to proliferate, but not so much that it doesn't dry out very slowly. And so if that balance is not achieved, then salami doesn't happen. And I don't have a curing chamber with temperature and humidity control. So when I make salami, it's a little bit of a gamble because I have to pick the right time of year. And it's really difficult to get 6 solid weeks of high humidity on Vashon, which is, I guess 3 weeks could make it work here. It just changes so radically from day to day. And definitely by the time we get to this December cold snap where we're freezing every night, it is just dry as a bone up here. So I guess it's really like fall. Fall and spring is when it's the most humid, but still cool enough to do salami for us. It's a tricky thing. And that is, my general, prejudice for not having really complex kit is really challenged by the fact that sometimes my salami doesn't go well. Because we only make it like once a year, when we slaughter our pigs. And it's definitely one of the most enjoyable. It's like my family's favorite thing. The kids love the salami. And so when we lose it, just because it's, we had a few super dry days, it's a bummer. And it's during those times that I'm like, man, a little bit of temperature and humidity control would be nice if we're going to eat salami. Yeah, that's part of the challenge of trying to work with simple kit and your environment, because maybe we're not supposed to make salami here, Maybe that's not the terroir. The salami that I make is very Italian, and this is definitely not a Mediterranean climate. And so might need to be a little more creative and maybe look a little further north in Europe for ideas of fermented meat that aren't so humidity sensitive. I don't know if those exist, but it'd be something to look into. Yeah. I think a super dry climate is just not a salami climate. I think that's the unfortunate news. But that doesn't mean that you're not able to make and enjoy tangy sausages. So when I think of what are the things that make salami so delicious and enjoyable, and it's that perfect balance, I think, of salt, fat, flavor, the savory, intense porky flavor that is harmonized by the tanginess, the acidity of the salami, and the other flavors that are created through the fermentation, which can be nutty and buttery and sweet. And I think that those can be achieved through a minimally aged salami. So one thing that we do sometimes is I guess every time, when we harvest our pigs, every year, for just our family, I'll make, lots of sausage, linked sausage, just normal sausage that we intend to cook. And one thing you'll find is very common if you read any historical accounts on salami making, like this one, or anything by Jane, actually. They're drawing from traditions that are pre the widespread use of refrigerant. And so all sausage, fresh sausage that was intended to be cooked, would basically become salami because they couldn't just freeze it. You would make a whole bunch of sausage, you would mix your salt in with your ground meat and your spices, stuff it into casings, and then you would hang it in your cellar or in your larder. And you would go down and cut off as many links as you wanted to fry up for your meals. But because that is not a frozen environment, the salami continues to evolve and ferment and dry, or the sausage does, until it becomes salami, essentially. And so you can achieve those really delicious, tangy, slightly acidic salami flavors with your fresh sausage just by letting it hang around in your fridge for, maybe a week before you wrap it and freeze it. And that week's time will be enough for that sausage to get a little bit of that really nice tang. Now, we taste this tang in all industrially produced, grocery store available sausages. They don't achieve it by fermentation. They achieve it by nitrite or ascorbic acid, literally just adding acid to the sausage. And that is a delicious harmony. The salt, fat, and acid is a nice thing. I think the grocery store versions overdo it, and they're insipid because they cut out the fat, and the flavor of the salt is very much subdued, so you just kind of get this mildly tangy, bland thing. But you can achieve that, and I think if in your own home sausage making, if you want that slightly tangy, mildly acidic balance with the salt, fat, and the acid, then you stuff the sausage, let it sit out, and you want to salt it 2.5% by weight is the key, because that will kick in the fermentation of the proper bacteria, but disallow the fermentation of the improper bacteria, the nefarious ones. 2.5% by weight of the entire meat mix. If you salt it at that degree, let it sit in your warm kitchen on the counter, it will begin to ferment, and you let it do that overnight, and then put all the links in your fridge, and it's going to be way more than you can finish, depending on the batch you make, in a couple weeks. And so at about the 1 week mark, after you've been pulling off of it and frying as needed from your fridge, just wrap them and freeze them. And then this will give you a sausage that you cook, not a raw salami sausage, that will have that nice tangy flavor. And that's what we've done, and I really, really like it. Because the freezer kills sausage, man. Ugh. It messes with the texture. Particularly if you add things like wine and beer and fresh, real garlic, as I hope you do. Because those oils and those alcohols don't freeze, and so it messes up the texture. So, Anthony, you have a copa cured and hanging for a month. How do I know if it's ready? So, cellulose sheets. I've never done that. So, how do you know it's ready? Copa is a matter of personal taste. Go up and squeeze it, and it's just gonna get harder the longer it hangs. So, let's see. I would say, in my climate, it's usually about a 6-week thing, maybe 8 weeks. But, gosh, I've even let it go longer than that. I don't even count. That's the thing. That's why I don't have a time to give you. I don't count the weeks or the days. I basically just keep an eye on it. And I think what I'm looking for is even okay, this is it. I got it. I want it to be evenly dry. Do you know what I mean? So what will happen with it is the exterior will start to dry first. I hope that's visible. Yeah, the exterior around the perimeter of the dimension of the copa will start to dry first. Worst case scenario, and this isn't probably not going to happen with you, but if it's a really dry hanging environment, that exterior will dry so much that it will prevent the interior from drying. And it will create a seal and lock in the moisture on the interior. And that is just kind of a loss. It's a bummer. Mainly with salami, it's probably actually not that big of a deal with copa. But that is called case hardening. Phenomena you can avoid by having a more humid environment and a casing, which you do have, in the form of the cellulose casing. So, all that to say, what I'm looking for is even dryness all the way through. And you don't even know that until you cut into it sometimes. It'll have a more hard texture. And so when I cut into it, I want all of the meat to kind of be an even more darker, almost burgundy color, because the moist, undried meat is going to still have that red, pink, fresh, moist, meat color to it. Yeah, that's what I look for in the copa. And I would assume, that's about 8 weeks if you're in the Pacific Northwest, maybe a little longer. The longer you hang it, the harder it will get. The advantage to pulling it down and starting to cut into it before the time, earlier than, the full and complete dryness, even dryness is achieved, is that it'll be easier to slice. So, and that's not a small thing. The sliceability of a piece of meat is directly related to its edibility, because it's got to be easy to get into. And if you're trying to carve shavings off of a rock, you're not going to taste that much of it because it's too dry, and you're not going to enjoy it. So, and you're not going to want to pick that battle every time. So, yeah, 6 to 8 weeks, even dryness. If you're hanging it in a place where if you heat with wood, that will really dry out the air big time, even if you have a teapot on the wood stove. And that would tend to dry out a copa a little quicker than desirable. It won't spoil it or anything, but you'll probably get some case hardening. So as far away from the wood stove, I would say, is possible. I hang mine in the most humid place on my property, which is my butcher shop, which is really low. Most humid indoor place, I guess. And then you have it wrapped in cellulose sheets. So I've never used those. I'm not familiar with them. When I cure copa, I cure it without any casing. And I know that I've got a humid enough environment in my shop to not require a casing. But casings are awesome. So theoretically, as opposed to empirically, I would say that I can imagine that being a non-oxygen environment, but because it's on the surface of the meat, that is the same as that which accepted the salt. You applied salt to the surface of the meat, that really drops the pH of the surface, and it binds the water. So, the surface of a copa, by the time you put it into the cellulose sheets, which is after you've salted it, right? The water is bound, and the acidity is high. Both of those things not so conducive to the growth of Clostridium botulinum or any bacteria. So it's a very almost sterile surface, almost, because Clostridium botulinum needs more than just an anaerobic environment. It needs a high pH and free water, available water. And since the surface of a meat or of any whole muscle cure is where the salt is, it's really it's a salty, acidic. The water is bound in that environment. So even the most mainstream American curing books will not require cure number 1 or cure number 2 nitrates for copa, even if you're stuffing it in a casing, which is theoretically, it sounds inconsistent, but I think just that surface is so the water is so bound, the pH is so low that I don't think you have to worry about it being an anaerobic environment. There were too many hurdles there for Clostridium botulinum, in my view. And I've cured plenty of copas in casings also, so I don't think you need to worry about that. What are my favorite porcine parts to use for sausage or salami if your end goal was also to utilize as many other cuts for charcuterie as possible? Good question. That is always the challenge in my household, because Lauren my wife Lauren wants the maximum sausage, and I get it. It is the ultimate comfort food, and it is easy to prepare, and it is it's effortlessly delicious because most of the work, all the seasoning, even the chewing is done up front. The grinder pre-chews it, and so we like a lot of sausage from our pigs. And I'm always, pulling for the more interesting cures that we eat in little tiny slivers or whatever. So, what parts do we use? What we do is usually almost all the sirloins. So the meat around the pelvis always goes to sausage for us, because there's enough fat there at the very least, and there's plenty of back fat, which you really need in the sausage. So sirloins were really good. And then you've got the shoulder. I don't think I have a diagram here, but you've got the shoulder, and the copa comes from the shoulder, and then maybe I'll even pull off a big strip of back fat from the shoulder for lardo. So when it comes to meat from the shoulder for curing, or for sausage, it would be the picnic shoulder. So the lower half of the shoulder that is closer to the front hock or the front arm. So that's usually where our sausage comes from, even for salami. And those are perfect meats because, again, they're fatty, and that fat is also back fat. A lot of it is, enough of it is, to give your sausage that really good texture. So those are my favorite porcine parts to use for sausage and salami. If I'm going to make an exclusive batch of salami, I might do a little more separation of fat and lean, and I'll grind the lean on a fine plate, and then I'll grind the fat on a really large plate, so there's more chunks of fat, and that just looks pretty. And I think when you have a little more lean in a salami, there's a little bit more water binding, which is a good thing. It's another step in managing the fermentation. So, yeah. So you can't find, Daniel, any sources on whether or not it would be considered safe to cure wild pig, since they do not have a controlled diet. Do you think trichinosis could survive the curing and drying process? Good question. So here's the thing about trichinosis. As you know, that is, of course, the worry with wild pig, because they eat carrion. They eat things that have died and are rotting on the ground. And the trichina worm can only be found in pork if that pig eats the flesh of another animal wherein that worm resides. So that's how trichinosis happens in pork. And then you only get the trichinosis worm in your flesh, which you really don't want, it being a flesh-eating worm and all. The only way you get it is if the meat is cooked to a temperature that's any less than 137 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 160. It doesn't have to be completely burnt like that. So 137 degrees Fahrenheit kills the trichina worm. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking about curing and drying process. So worms, like bacteria, and this is, they need moisture, they need water, and the only study I saw on this, and I can't remember the source, you'd probably have to look it up on the Google machine, suggested that in the case of a prosciutto, which is salted and then cured and dried for a long time, like 2 years, in that kind of dry, salty environment, the trichina worm cannot thrive and it dies. So there's that. There's also in Italy, many salumieries, and even Northern Europe, you will see cured hams, prosciuttos, the back leg of a pig, from wild boars, with the hair still on. Yeah, pretty cool, right? So there is definitely a tradition of curing boar meat for ham over prolonged periods. And if I were to approach that, if I were to cure wild boar meat, that's what I would do. I would do the more prosciutto style. So salting so as to cure and to preserve it, but then let it hang for a very long time, prosciutto style, 2 years. so that that intense dryness makes things very inhospitable to the survival of the trichina parasite. That's what I would do, and that's the history that I'm aware of, and I think even studies have kind of come along and kind of verified that to a degree. Oh, you have a root cellar. That's awesome. Yeah, that should be a good environment. Root cellars are really cool in the basement because they tend to be have a more consistent humidity, consistent temperature, and the only thing to keep an eye out for is lack of airflow, uh, and which may not even be a problem at all. But the way you know that it is if anything you hang down there within just a few days gets like crazy mold blooms. And it's not because mold is bad. It's fine. It only grows on the surface. It doesn't penetrate and fester. But so you can wipe it off and it's gone. But more or less, the lack of airflow is signaled by the rapid growth of mold. You know, if it's just in a few days you have this huge bloom, and it's not very appetizing looking or smelling mold, it's like long cat hair mold, that means there's just not enough air movement. And not enough, and it's a little humid. And both of those things can be mitigated by just a little airflow. So it just might mean leaving the door to the basement cracked, you know, or at the most putting a little fan in there. But again, you would only need to do that if you notice some pretty intense mold growth. And sliminess. You know, slimy is another good thing. Sliminess. There's lots of signs, you know, that you can use to judge the progress of your cures, and sliminess is a good one. There's mold is an indicator of humidity and acidity. So white mold, well, its final form is white, the penicillium mold. It starts like with a green and yellow and blue thing, and then it gets white. But it's close grained. It almost looks like toothpaste smeared on the meat. That shorter grain mold indicates that the environment is nice and humid and that the meat is acidic, which is good. You want acidic cures. So that's what mold means. And then if you get slime on the meat, that's bacteria. That's not so good. It doesn't mean it's a goner, you know. It just means that something is growing on the surface and it's tacky. It's sticky. You touch it and it's tacky, and that's bacteria. Now, you can fix that with as subtle an adjustment as airflow, you know, and that bacteria will slowly reside and die, and then maybe you'll get a bloom of mold. But those are all kind of signs that are cues to how conducive the environment is to proper curing. Most of those indicating humidity and airflow and acidity of the meat, which are all things that you can remedy. You can drop the acidity of a piece of hanging meat by smoking it. I'm sorry, drop the pH, which is to say increase the acidity, by smoking it. Yeah, and you can lower humidity by introducing airflow and all that stuff. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with pulled pork, ever, far be it from me. It's just an argument for raising more pigs, so we can have our copas and our pulled porks. Okay, curing wild pigs. I want to make sure I'm not missing some here. I think I got them. If I miss a question, just repost it, because I feel like every time I notice I miss one after the fact. Yeah, the freezer is a great way to sterilize wild boar. That's a good point, Ellen, because trichinosis and a lot of things die in the freezer. That is kind of a sterilizing technique, and there is no rule against pulling out frozen meat, thawing it out, and then curing it. It's totally fine. In fact, some people prefer to do it that way. I never have, but you can the water molecules expand in the meat and rupture a lot of the cells of the meat, and that actually can theoretically aid in the diffusion of salt and the removal of water throughout the meat after it's been frozen for a while. So, if you want to go ahead and cure wild boar, freeze the meat for a while first. It's a great idea. It's a great way to go. Is it possible in the future to get a tour of my butcher shop? Probably, yeah. We gotta get more things going on there. My butcher shop is right at my house, so it's, it's not a retail space here in Vashon, as I'm sure you know, Hugh. But it's just a 400 square foot little thing right on my driveway. And we are trying to develop over the next year many different packages. Because right now we kind of have our flagship magnum opus, which is the family pig class, or a 2 or 3 day sheep harvesting class, and these are all big commitments, 3-day commitments, and so we want to try to get smaller things going, so that we can get people in there for just 1 day, for smaller little packages, courses and feasts, because they should go together. But yeah, ideas in putting one together. My shop is totally unique. Hey, that's a good idea, Ellen. We should do a little. Also, Hugh, if you follow me on Instagram. Oh boy, now I have to remember what my Instagram tag is. I'm sure it's Farmstead Meatsmith. You'll find it, Farmstead Meatsmith. I post Instagram videos a lot of me in the shop doing stuff, and always pictures. And I would say that my shop is totally unique. It is not at all typical of butcher shops. So the general strategy today, at least in America, with butcher shops is lots of stainless, plastic, floor drains, basically a hosable environment. It's hosable, decor, so that you can spray a hose on all the walls and scrub everything. Rinsable, hosable. My shop is not that. My shop is, what is it? It's hospitable. But not just to people, to bacteria, because I don't indulge in the fantasy that I can sterilize the whole thing perfectly. In fact, I have lots of wood, so it's much more of a traditional approach. I cut on wood. All of my walls are exposed wood, and even on my concrete floor I have sawdust. And so instead of a mopping regimen, I have a sweeping cleaning regimen, and the sawdust prevents me from slipping all over the place. And if drops of blood or globules of fat get on the floor, they're immediately dehydrated, and the water is absorbed in the sawdust, and it balls up, and it can be swept out much more readily than smearing it around with a hot mop. So I think it's actually much cleaner, and this goes all the way back to the 70s, man. Wood is just cleaner than plastic, because it has capillary action, it has dehydrating capabilities, it absorbs water. Plastic doesn't. So that's kind of my general approach, and you could just look at old school butcher shops to see what mine is. But yeah, we should get you out there, and at the very least, put something up on Facebook of the shop. Another thing that I like to consider is the management of heavy weight. And, if you're in your shop just going to try to work with whole sides or whole carcasses, one of your primary considerations is the avoidance of lifting those carcasses with your lower back. Don't do that. I did it for years, and it's not so good. So I have a trolley system where everything's hanging, so we're using vertical space, and it creates workflow. It's incredibly invaluable, and I only know how invaluable it is because I did without it for so many years, and so I really recommend in building into your shop from a workflow that comes from the outside inside over the table, without you having to lift a thing. That's the goal. Excuse me. Yeah, so what else about my shop? I don't bleach any wood surfaces. I don't sterilize them. I don't even use soap on them. Because soap is a saponified oil. It separates oil and it changes the surface tension of water. And so it gets in there. And wood is so porous that it never really gets out. It's like a sponge. And I hate the flavor of soap. It's like the most it's the second most culinary discouraging thing for me. Bleach is number one. So with my cutting surfaces, I'll clean them with salt. I'll clean them with vinegar. I have a spray bottle with vinegar and water in it, and I'll spray that on my table, and I'll scrape it hard with a bench knife. They make these wonderful tools called butcher block brushes, and it looks like copper, but I'm not sure, but it's a really coarse steel brush, and you rub it along your work surface, your wood cutting board, and it's like a sander. It takes off a top little layer. It's beautiful. It works excellent. And then if I'm doing something that generates lots of water, stuffing sausage tends to generate lots of water because you're pulling casings out of the water they're soaking in, or splitting a pig head. Maybe there's lots of blood on the table now. I have really fine sawdust, and I'll rub that and scrub that on the table, and that will absorb all the liquid, right? And then maybe I'll give it a spray with my apple cider vinegar dilution and scrape it off. So soap has never touched my table, and as long as I am around, it never will. Yeah. So yes, you do need a table like that. Everyone does. I think everyone needs a butcher shop as a kitchen. So our kitchens now are so inept. They're just so incapable of real food production. We all need 400 square feet butcher shops. We all need walk-ins. We all need humongous cutting tables so that the kitchen, the food preparation, can include butchery and curing, right? And just outside, you've got skinning and slaughter. All right. Craigslist is the place for all that stuff, by the way. That's where I found everything in my shop. Okay. Have I listened to the Meat Block podcast? Oh, yeah, I have a little bit. I've heard just a couple of them. Yeah, trolley system. Yeah, the Meat Block guys are fun. They give a good industry perspective. They're small scale, but they're still much larger scale than I am because I'm just ridiculously infinitesimal. But they're a good source for USDA slaughtering practices on a smaller scale. A couple of those guys work with USDA outfits. I think one with a mobile outfit and one with a stationary building. It's cool. It's the environment that is completely sterilized, right? It's plastic and stainless, and at a certain volume of production, I totally understand that. Hair nets and everything, because they're processing a lot more animals every day, so that you get a great perspective, and which is part of why I am reluctant to become custom exempt, Daniel. I have we do classes, so we're kind of an educational thing, and I've had several talks with the Department of Agriculture. I've had them out to my place and everything, and my final hurdle is the wood. They don't want me cutting on wood. And if you've been to my shop, anyone can tell that I can't get the wood out of the shop. It is all wood, and that is a no-no. It's got to be a hosable environment, so that's a tough one for me. Because It's interesting. As an individual, and again, I'm so micro, I have such high standards for the artistry of what goes on in my shop that for me to go on and get a lot of the certifications, most of which I don't even relate to me, or all of them, but I don't want to go on and get them, because in order to do so, I would have to lower my standards to meet theirs. That's the crazy thing. And so I just, as a personal thing, I can't quite go with a lot of those. Not to say it won't happen in the future. In order to do so, I would have to do it in a way that would not necessitate lowering my own standards, and that would require lots of work and negotiation, which I don't have the time for right now. But it's not impossible, because fortunately they are people, and you're working with people, and particularly with the state departments of ag, there's a little more personal interaction. There's more leeway, not leeway, but there's more room for working things out and meeting in the middle. But it requires lots of HACCPs and variance plans, and with a one-man show, it's just not possible. I don't have the time for that. I always think that the thing we need is just more butchers, so that we could focus a little more on quality. It is a common, very real problem right now in our region that USDA slaughter, so again, that's totally outside of my world, that is the slaughter of animals that will be sold as retail cuts, if that makes sense. So a chop at a time, 1 or 2 chops at a time, rather than as a share. So pre-sold on the hoof, that's the custom exempt that Daniel's talking about, whereas the shops are selling retail meat, and those animals have to be slaughtered under United States Department of Agriculture inspection, so an agent on site from the federal level. In our region right now, there is nothing available. There were a couple mobile slaughter units and two buildings where you could get USDA slaughter, but they have all shut down because the scale is not large enough, and they operate on such tight margins that if they get if they get carded, if the inspector finds some bacteria somewhere in the building and shuts them down for a couple weeks, and they have to recall a bunch of product, which I understand, it's horrible, that puts them out of business. They're gone, because they're operating on such a small scale. They have such tight margin that it just can't work. So it's a major challenge for small scale livestock farmers in my region that have to basically chase whichever USDA slaughter facility happens to be up and running at the time, and it's constantly changing. There's a few mobile slaughter trucks hanging around in this region, but they are so expensive to operate. You need 2 butchers, and you need to accommodate the minimum that the inspector needs to be on site, and because he will only work you can only get him on site if you have a certain number of hours per week to justify having USDA inspection. And not only do you need 2 skilled slaughtermen on the USDA slaughter truck, but they need a CDL. They need to be able to drive a semi-truck, and you need a lot of stuff on site. And basically those machines are so expensive to build and then to operate that they are utterly economically unviable. They cannot sustain themselves, and so you can't pay the people enough that run it, and they tend to be cooperatively owned rather than or funded by nonprofits, because they cannot sustain themselves by charging enough for their services, and so they're just constantly shutting down, constantly changing hands. But that's a very common tale. So yes, beef. I slaughtered 2 Dexters in Enumclaw a really nice guy, Brian. He's come to a couple of classes, and he raises really beautiful Katahdin sheep and a couple Dexters every year. And these were beautiful Dexters. I think they're a Dexter Angus cross, so they're a little larger than a standard Dexter would be, a pure Dexter. But they were beautiful. You know, they were so tame, which is a huge relief to a slaughterman. Good grief. They were, 2 feet away from me, just on the other side of the fence for the kill shot, and that was just perfect. And they were great. Got to harvest them. My walk-in is packed because I have 2 beeves and 4 big sheep in there, and I just butchered a deer out of there, so for a while it was really tight in there. But I've arranged with Brian, the farmer, to trade some of my processing costs for a rib roast for Christmas. So we are going to have beef for Christmas, which seems to be serendipitously it happens every year, for which I'm very happy. So we get to have beef this Christmas, which is really, really special. We don't eat beef; we eat pork. Because we don't ever buy meat, and so we eat the pork that we raise, and rabbit and duck, because those are the things that we raise. And so it's like it's a major festival. It's a big deal for us, so we're very excited to have that wonderful Dexter beef. Some of the best beef I've ever tasted has been from Dexter cows. Yeah, so you don't have any butchers out there, Daniel. The main crop is cattle, but none of the beef in the stores are local. Common tale, man. Yeah, it is very sad. And the same thing, right? There's not enough slaughtermen out there. There's not enough. Our whole, I think part of it is that we simply don't have, at least in the West, a tradition of small-scale livestock processing or production. Since since Lewis and Clark since we've done the steady march west in this continent, we pretty much were at the industrial stage of chronology and starting right at mass production and mass processing. Whereas if you go into Europe, they do, of course, they have pre-industrial traditions of small-scale livestock processing and husbandry. Now they're losing them to the same things that were our first line of defense here, and were our first marketing strategies here in America. They're losing them to the grocery stores and definitely to large processing plants. But the tradition is so old that there's still lots of that going on there. There's still lots of small-scale slaughterhouses. They have to fight to retain them, those traditions. I feel like we have to create ours because we just never had them. Maybe in the East and in the South there was a little more of that going on, just because those are the older parts of our nation. But even at the oldest, we're still so young. We just don't have traditions of small-scale livestock processing. So we actually have to do the old thing in a completely new way. We have to create the old way out of nothing. Whereas they just need to preserve, I think, a lot of their old traditions. Oh, cool. Pork to turkey. Sounds cool. Oh, cool. A reverse sear. So you're going to, Daniel, that means that you're going to cook it at a moderate temperature, and then at the end kick up the heat to really sear the outside, I think. Is that what reverse sear means? I think, how am I going to cook mine? So it's fresh, which is key. This is why I am I haven't even really thought about the recipe yet, other than hot and fast, and then moderate heat to cook it through. Which is basically how I think of roasting in general. Roasting anything in the oven. Those are my categories. High heat at the beginning to brown it, and then moderate heat to cook it just rare, And because it's fresh, I know it's going to be crazy delicious. It's not coming out of the freezer. I'm going to probably cut it off of the carcass on Monday. And smother it in olive oil and salt and pepper. And then I'm not gonna take the spine out. I'm not gonna take the rib cap, fat cap off. So the surface of the roast will be that from which I skinned the hide, took the hide off. I'm not going to French it. I'm not going to de-chine it to take the spine out. I'm just gonna roast the whole thing, very rough, and probably, at high heat for a half an hour to get that crisp and caramelize and brown the exterior, and then take it down to medium heat. And I don't know the size yet, so this is all. And I don't necessarily even have a calculation for time relative to size and cooking time. But it's probably going to be like a 25-minute high heat deal, and then take it down to 325 or 350 medium heat for 40 minutes or 50 minutes, judging just from the size of what I can see of the rib roast while it's on the forequarter of beef. So something like that. Yeah. And I have suet. I have some suet. So we're going to also, I want to make some Yorkshire pudding, which would be quite delicious. Okay, so you cook it at about 150. Okay, low and slow. Cool, dude. Until it's 125. Take out and wrap in foil for 30 minutes. Blast oven to 500 and put it back in until crispy. Cool. Yeah, so low, slow. That's a good idea, because, that would be a good idea for a very untrimmed rib roast, which is what mine is. I'm not going to trim anything off. And the reason people do trim a lot of, especially the rib cap, off of a rib roast is because it's tough. And so it's a high use muscle. And under hot and fast cooking conditions, it just kind of gets chewy. It'll get brown, but it's chewy. It's not broken down enough. But your reverse sear, it sounds like a good idea because it's really low temp, and which is going to mean it's going to take a while. It'll be a long cook. And that prolonged cooking should break down a lot of that tough, sinewy rib cap, untrimmed stuff, and then blast it for 30 minutes. That's a great idea. It sounds awesome. So it took 6 hours. Yeah. I might try that. That sounds like a great idea. Oh, yeah. That was for Thanksgiving. We had I stuffed a pig head. Our pig, one that we raised on our property. One of 4 this year. With sausage. It was so fun. It was delicious. It was uncalculable quantity of food. That was the biggest challenge. And I've got a big family, There's 7 of us, and then we had my sister-in-law and her husband, and both my in-laws, and my brother-in-law, and we barely made a dent in that thing. So it was a ton of very rich food. It was delicious. It was cooked all the way through. I boned out the face, took all the meat off the head, and really carefully so as not to create any cuts in the skin on the exterior. And then I made it was kind of a pate-like sausage, super rich, I put pistachios in it, and I don't even remember. Maybe some apple and onion and salt and pepper and brandy or something. And how did I do it? I had the pig head laid out flat, so with the full jowl, everything. Packed it in on the inside and then folded up the sides. And then, did I knit it? Did I sew it? Oh no, I just tied all the way around it, yeah, just with butcher twine. And, things like that are effortless to cook because they're so fatty, it will never dry out. And so I think I did a lot of what Daniel, just mentioned with his rib roast. It was a low temp for a long time, and then whacked it up at the end to really crisp the skin. And it was just delicious. It was so good. We served it with we had lots of cheeses and sweet spreads on the table, and mustard and sauerkraut and crackers, and that was kind of the appetizer for our Thanksgiving. And all of those tangy, sweet, crispy things really help to balance out with a super rich pork head poached sausage. It turned out really good. It was a lot of fun. I would definitely do it again. I wonder if I would change it. Invite more people. That's what I would do. I would invite more people to help us eat that thing. We had leftovers for quite a while. Oh, beautiful. Boned out piglet. Yeah, stuffing is a beautiful thing with pigs. It's I think I did one for a wedding once. We roasted a cooney? Yeah, I think it was a cooney on a spit, and stuffed it with rabbits, and it came out really well. The rabbits were an afterthought because the wedding was approaching, the guest list kept growing, and I was looking at the cooney in the walk-in thinking, this thing's not big enough. What are we gonna do? And so I slaughtered a bunch of my rabbits, and we stuffed it full of rabbit. And so we had rabbit, basically confit inside of the cooney, in addition to the pig meat. It was pretty awesome. Yeah, that's tough. It's I don't know how, there was definitely some, a little bit, well, not really. For Thanksgiving with my stuffed pig head, there wasn't much reticence at all. It was nice. I do remember, Lauren cracks me up. Her dad is a wonderful guy, and he's kind of the life of the party wherever he is. But I brought the pig head out and I put it down on the table, and he was making over it. But Lauren, being his oldest daughter, and knowing him very well, she wanted to make sure that he tried it. And so he was making over it, and she couldn't help herself. She was like, "Dad, put a bite in your mouth." She had that desire to make sure you actually eat it. You see what this is and see how it tastes. Because there is a little reticence, Daniel, like you're saying, at a restaurant, particularly with dishes that retain the elements of the animal that we associate with sentience, heads, eyes, individuating features, when those are on there, there's a little bit of reticence because it doesn't disguise, but rather it makes the sentient origins of the livestock just blatantly obvious, very apparent. And that can be tricky. Like what I was reading from Jane Grigson at the beginning. It's tricky for those of us who are used to getting our meat from packages. So, have I published a detailed description of lamb slaughter technique? We are considering slaughtering one of our 7-month-old black belly rams. Let's see. I haven't published one. Right? No, I haven't. I'm trying to think if there's any video. Oh! Yes. So, Grass-Fed Homestead. Dave, go to Grass-Fed Homestead on YouTube. And he filmed, Dan Oman is his name, and he filmed some of a lamb slaughter class that he attended with me. Check it out. That will help you with lamb slaughter techniques. Let's see, and if you're referring specifically to the kill of a lamb by slaughter, then that's in there. He recorded that. My approach is kind of different. Grass-Fed Homestead, Dan Oman. I don't shoot sheep, but that's only because I am very proficient at just using the knife. If my knife was dull, which, God forbid, may it never be, and I wasn't proficient at just doing the kill with the knife, I would use the gun. Because I think the key is, with any slaughter, is to pick the method that you are best at, because that's how you can guarantee the most decisive kill, which is always the goal, right? You don't want unnecessary suffering. If we can do anything, we should reduce unnecessary suffering. And so, I very much have a technique of killing sheep that is, I'm good at it. And it involves a very conscientious build-up to the kill. Very frequently, and I would say 90% of the time, more important than the actual kill itself is the build-up to it. If you're chasing the animal around, if you're sawing at the neck with your dull knife, if you're not handling the livestock well and you find yourself lunging at them and missing and they're jumping and everything, the stress levels just go through the roof. And that build-up is what causes the anxiety and will make delivering the decisive kill that much harder. So much of it is build-up, is pre-strategy. And so you want to get your lamb in a very tight enclosure so chasing doesn't happen. That's the key. So if you have a barn, get them in a tight corral so that you can just grab them. And then you got to manage the body. If you control the body of the sheep, you control its mind. It shouldn't have a hint of being able to escape. So you have to be super decisive if you're going to do the knife technique, which is what I do. Oh, you did view it. Oh, yeah. Yes. So for a little bit of the discussion, yeah, just it's all the build-up and managing the body. And with a ruminant, with a sheep that is a prey animal, right? Managing the body means getting its forelegs off the ground. Because its number one defense against predators, which you are in this scenario, is to flee. So if you remove its ability to flee, it more or less, as in so much as it is possible, it surrenders. It's really an amazing thing. And you can see in the video, when I lay the sheep down, exactly how I hold it. I bend the head back so its jaw is directly facing to the sky. And you can't be halfway, it's got to be all the way. And its legs aren't touching the ground. I'm not holding it down. I'm not sitting on it and pushing on it. That just stresses it out. I'm just holding its head and tilting it so it can't get its legs under it. Do you know what I mean? Its legs are off the ground. That's the key. It's handling to that stage. And you can even practice it beforehand, before you get the knife out and do the cut. Practice handling the sheep. It'll even get used to it, and that'll just make things even easier, I would say. So, the build-up, the handling. If, for whatever reason, you have a bad back or an injury or a dull knife, and all of that sounds too involved, because it is physically demanding, especially the first few times you do it, and you're not quite familiar with how to do it efficiently yet, and you're using more power than is necessary. If you're not as confident in it, then use a gun. Use a gun and shoot the brain. And in the case of a sheep, that's above the level of the eyes, right? In between the eyes and the ears, basically. And a .22 Magnum, I guess, would be ideal. A .22 long rifle with high velocity, full metal jackets would also do it. Yeah. So, for the kill, that would be my approach. Do the thing you are most certain of being able to execute in the most decisive manner, if that makes sense. All right, you've got Jürgen. Your guanciale was salted a little long. Yeah, so the fortunate thing about guanciale is that it's very fatty, which makes it a little harder to oversalt than leaner meat. because of the water content of fat being lower than that of meat. So there's less diffusion of salt into the fat than there would be in lean meat. So you could just try to hang it, rinse it, dry it, and hang it, and see how it tastes in several weeks. And it might not be crazy salty. If it is, you might notice on the guanciale there's a circular, more or less, puck of lean meat. That's the masseter muscle. That thing will be crazy salty. But it might be the only thing that's crazy salty. If you just take that off, the rest of it might be okay. But let's say it's not. Then you can soak them in fresh water. You can soak the jowls in fresh water for just a couple hours, and that will remove a lot of the salt. And if it's in the dry, cool time of year for you, you can just soak them in fresh water for a couple hours, rinse them, dry, or just dry them with towels and hang them, and they'll probably be fine. Again, you'll know if they start to spoil on you. It's going to be painfully obvious, and I really doubt they will if you're in the northern hemisphere and you're coming into the colder months. It'll be fine. So soak in fresh water, dry, hang, and that will reduce the salt. Yeah, and it depends on the kind of brine too. If they were in an EQ cure, in a plastic bag, and you measure the brine very particularly, then it's impossible to oversalt, because theoretically you don't put more salt than it's 2% by weight, basically, which never tastes too salty. If it's just a brine tub, then it could be oversalted, in which case you just want to do the soak. So yeah, sitting Ellen to manage their body is tricky, and what I do. So sheep shearers are really good at this, at managing the body of a lamb and submitting it, because they'll sit them on their butt, just like you say. And again, their feet are off the ground, right? They're not touching the ground, and so they are therefore calm, as calm as they can be. And that's one way. What I find myself doing, I first grab their head, and pull it straight up, so they're looking towards the sky, which is one way to eliminate their ability to flee, right? They can't see where they're going. And, the sun feels nice. Pull their head straight up. And if I need to, I can walk them anywhere that way. Kind of hold onto their body with their head up, and I can kind of walk them if I need to move them. And then the way I tend to get them on the ground is I can just lift them. Usually they're only going to weigh, the lambs I tend to slaughter, 80 pounds or so. And so I will grab the flank, that part between their body and their back leg. There's stretchy skin there. And I grab that, and then I put their head out there, not in here, because they can butt you, they can hit you, even pulled sheep, and boy, that's a good knock. I've had that happen to me, so I don't do that anymore. I put their head out there, and I kind of hold on to their body, and then with this hand I grab the flank, so I'm standing right beside them, and I lift up and I hip up. I use my hips to get their legs out like that and down on the ground. So that's how I handle them, right on their side. And then I pull their head back and swipe my knife that way, away from myself. And where precisely do I cut? I will tell you, on the larynx. Okay? Right there. I don't know if you can see that. On the Adam's apple. On their voice box. I've got a nasty one right there. So right there. That's the spot. When you pull their head back and they're facing literally, the top of their head is complete, their eyes, even the tip of their nose, is almost exactly flat on the ground, that you'll be able to feel their larynx with your hand quite distinctly. And you pull it back and you cut right down on the larynx, and you want to go all the way to bone. You're going through larynx, so trachea, clearly, through esophagus, all the way to bone. And in doing that, it's a big long cut as opposed to a pig, which is just a jab. This is you're opening up the whole thing. So you're going to have two, you got it, by the way. You got it when you get two streams of blood spraying. And even if they're not spraying, look, maybe they're just spraying into the head, but those two arteries need to be severed, and they will bleed out that way. And again, only do this, this method is only more humane than the kill if it's one swipe, right? No sawing. If you feel like there's going to be any sawing involved, then just get the gun out, do the gun. So that's where I would cut them, and incidentally, that's also where I'd cut them if I shot them. So if you do the gun, you still want to jump in there, cut right there so that they're bleeding out, because even after you take the brain out, their heart's going to continue to beat and will pump out the blood. So yes, does that make sense? That's precisely where to cut, right on the larynx, that way. Yeah, they do have really hard heads designed for impact. That's why I have taken the time to discipline myself in just the knife. I think if you can do it very well, if you can't, then forget about it. But if you can do it very well, I think it has the potential to be more humane than just a shot to the head. It definitely eliminates the variable of missing, of accuracy. Yeah, anyway. But do the one you're best at. That's what I say. That's the best way to guarantee that decisive kill, which is the point. Yes. Thank you, Jürgen. Merry Christmas to you. The River Cottage handbook for that recipe is great. And yeah, I think that should work fine. Dry it off and soak it and then hang it. Okay. Wow. That time kind of went quickly. Time flies when you're talking and shivering a little bit. Okay, well, any final questions, anyone? It's 11:15. Target temperature range for hanging sheep after slaughter. Cool. I guess if we had to pick a target, I would say refrigerator. So, which is 38, 35 degrees. But, there's lots of flexibility there. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, it's perfect. Just hang it outside. Even if we get up into the 50s, which we won't. Well, maybe we will. It's sometimes in the middle of the day. It's so dry right now. Not a cloud in the sky. And dryness is as important as coldness, I would say. Because high humidity is going to hold moisture on the meat, which is going to advance spoilage. So you want dry, cool, breezy, windy. Right here, where I'm sitting, would be the perfect place to hang your sheep. You could hang it in this for months, and it would never spoil. So you'll know, too, if you can just hang it in your cold garage, you just want to, your biggest hindrance, your biggest problem will not be cold this time of year. It'll probably be keeping critters away from it, cats or dogs or rats or raccoons. So might be your biggest challenge. But when I slaughter this time of year, frequently if I'm working under a tree, I just hoist it higher up in the tree and go to bed, and then start processing the next day or a few days thereafter. So refrigerator temperatures, but keep it dry, keep it cool. Thank you, Ellen. Merry Christmas to you. Freezes, no problem. No problem. If you just keep something over it, it's very unlikely to freeze. So just something under a porch. I wouldn't worry about that so much. All right. thank you, everyone. Look for this to be posted in the Meatsmith on the membership resources page with annotations and links and such. And we will see you next month at a live chat. Have a Merry Christmas. Enjoy your feasting. Worms in their livers and shouldn't be used. Yeah, it might have been roundworm. If it was just little white spots, just don't eat the liver rare. And if there's too many and it looks unappetizing, don't eat it. But a few white spots, roundworm, is very common in pigs that are raised outdoors. You shouldn't think that if that's what it was, that wasn't horrible husbandry. In fact, it's 99% of the pigs raised outdoors in this climate have roundworm. It's just an intestinal parasite, and it's not... only in very heavy loads is it detrimental, I would say. All right. Usually intestinal worms don't affect the meat, by the way, if it's roundworm. You'd want to know what kind of worm. That's the thing. And a vet could determine that, maybe. If your pigs are still alive, he could determine that by a fecal sample, usually. But unless they are emaciated and starving, and you can see their ribs, and they're obviously not thriving, and they have really loose stool, and they're not eating, then they're probably fine to eat. Intestinal worms don't actually affect the meat. At most, they would make the pig not thrive, so they would make them skinny. That's what I would say. Vets tend to be expensive, but yeah, if you've got a good one that can test the feces, that would be the way to find out. All right, best to you, everyone. Merry Christmas, and we will see you in the new year.